All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Charlie O'Donnell. I'm a partner with Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to get a startup job in this current environment. So I'll jump right into it. Oh, this is actually the first time I've ever used Canva for a presentation, so there are some fancy animations that I wasn't prepared for. So this may get a little wild. So first of all, by way of background, I have been a startup investor in venture capital since 2001. I've invested in over 100 startup companies. I've also done a lot of writing and instructing on career topics. I've taught at Fordham, NYU Poly, General Assembly, and also spoken about it in South by Southwest as well. And just have also, been through a lot of cycles, through 2008, the financial crisis, actually even seen the sort of tail end of the dot-com. I started in 2001 in venture capital, and I saw 10 negative quarters of performance in venture capital before I ever saw a positive one. So I've seen a few downturns and seen how companies perform. All right, so first of all, some of you may be joining because you got laid off, and or you feel like that's a thing that might be coming, and you're kind of worried about it. And look, it's okay. And the thing I'll say about that is absolutely nobody's career is up and to the right the entire duration. It's pretty routine for people to have, gaps, for people to take a step back before they leap 2 steps forward. And, in the startup world and technology world, which is obviously can be pretty volatile, it's not uncommon and totally expected, right? So, there doesn't need to be any extra baggage associated with it. Obviously, it's pretty stressful. It could be financially stressful, but for the purposes of this being a safe space to talk about it, we're all fine here. So I wanted to dispel a couple of myths about startups, and I want to make sure that we're all sort of talking about them in the same way, and I'll share my perspective. First of all, there's this myth that startups don't have money, and I will concede that startups, for the most part, since most of them are cash flow negative, since most of them are focused on a cash out date, a date in which they know that if they don't grow, they will run out of capital, that they'll have to go back to the fundraising market. They should be, and certainly more now, focused on the bottom line and focused on every last dollar that kind of goes out the door. But these are companies that are capitalized to grow. These are companies that are capitalized and financed to hit particular goals, right? So they have money. It's just probably more carefully earmarked than, let's say, at a big company that, might have a loose budget for headcount, or, because they had a person in a certain position last year, they obviously, when that person leaves, they're just going to replace them because that's what they do. Startups, when somebody leaves, every single position gets reassessed, right? Do we really need this? Do we need the same kind of person? Do we need the same seniority of person? So the money is more carefully watched for the most part. There's some exceptions. There have been time periods where money flew out the door, growth at all costs in terms of spending on advertising. During the pandemic, the company spent a lot of money on people tools and HR tools because it was a very stressful time for employees. but they certainly have capital. Now, one caveat I'll say to that is when I say that, I am talking about startups that have product market fit, that have a real business model, that are often venture backed, right? This represents a small percentage of all startups, right? So if you just went to some random startup meetup and there are 100 startups in the room, 90 to 95 of those 100 don't have capital, right? They are seeking capital, they're working on their pitch, or nobody has funded them yet. So, it is true that startups as a whole, don't necessarily have money. But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about companies with real business models, with real products to offer the market that are actually backed. And by the way, this is the majority of where the startup employees are, right? So by number, there's a bunch of onesie twosie startups that don't have real revenue, don't have real backing, haven't hit product market fit, that are kind of struggling, kind of a mess. Maybe some of them will turn out to be something, but they're all really small, right? Once you start get backing, that's when you get 10, 20, 50, 100, 200, 250 employees, 1,000 employees. And that's the bulk of the people working in the startup world, or working at these companies where, things are actually functioning, right? So you have to be careful when you say like, well, all startups. Is it all venture-backed startups with a functional business model, or are we just talking like any old startup? The current environment, everyone is cutting at all costs, right? Not necessarily true. There certainly was a period of belt tightening, but what startups tend to do is, they're kind of budget based, right? You may look at the performance of the public market or change in the perception of venture capital financeability and say, listen, we need to tighten things. We might need to cut some folks. We need to readjust our budget. But then once they do that, then they move forward, right? They adopt a plan and they say, this is what we're going with. And this is the best plan we can come up with, right? These are the 25, 250, however many people we need going forward. And this is our plan for the next 4 quarters, 8 quarters. And we feel that we've pushed out our, cash out date well into 2024. And then we're going with it, right? We're not going to cut any more people, barring some disaster. Like, this is our plan. We're now lean and mean. And if somebody leaves, we are going to replace them because everybody that we have here is needed, right? So the startup world isn't, running around with chickens without heads and constantly shedding. I think for the most part, startups are pretty lean right now. And they're going to be pretty stable going forward, sort of layoffs wise. The last myth I will say is that startups know who they need. And this is one thing that a lot of employees, people kicking the tires of the startup world, especially coming from the more corporate area, don't really get, right? If you are a technical founder for a company, you may not be familiar with how a marketing function should work, how a sales function should work. If you are a design-driven founder, you may not have a good sense of how the sales function might work, right? And so what tends to happen is you have some sense of like, okay, we need to hire some salespeople, we need to hire marketing people. The best founders will go and talk to somebody who has built one of those functions before, to try and figure out how they should sort of organize their that function, but they don't always get it right on the first try. So what tends to happen in the interactions is that you sort of approach a company, and your expectation, like if you were to go talk to a bigger corporate environment, they know they have budget for X position, because that is how they staffed the company previously. It's very structured, very standardized, very clear that like we are talking about open position X. We are hiring for an assistant regional marketer for this vertical, and that's what we're going after. And I'm comparing you against that needed skill set. Startups aren't necessarily like that, and there's some flexibility, right? If you come in and you are a product focused marketer and you are knowledgeable enough to be dangerous related to conversion best practices, landing pages, all of that sort of stuff, hiring you could affect whether or not they choose to hire a full-time front end designer. Because maybe they can get away with somebody on a part-time basis because you have sort of an overlapping skill set. They may be interviewing someone else who has slightly overlapping skill set to you, right? So you're trying to figure out like, okay, I'm in this interview. It's not quite clear because I think they really like me, but I don't really know if there's a position there. That may be because they're still trying to figure out how best to structure this group. They're probably thinking about some various different scenarios of, well, I could hire this person and that person, and then I won't need a full-time salesperson. So there's lots of stuff that's sort of in flux. So I'd highly encourage candidates to actually talk about the environments in which they fit best, right? To say, hey, in my experience in my last company, we did more of a, this kind of driven sale, and here's how we structured our team. And for this stage, this is how I think the org structure could work best. Help take some uncertainty and some lack of clarity off the table for a founder who may not necessarily be the expert in this particular area. All right, so the best way to address any kind of stressful, complicated endeavor is to form a plan, to break it down in small pieces, and that's what we're going to do here. So first step here is self-care, right? Is that whether or not you just got laid off or you're stressed about your current position and, or just stressed about job searching in general, right? You're someone who likes the comfort and safety of knowing where you're going to be in the next couple of months, and every time this comes up, this can be a stressful environment. This is where you have to start, right? People want to work with other people that bring the stress level down, that seem like, they're put together, even though no one's quite put together, and we're all a little more tightly wound than we probably like to be. But if you don't take care of these basics first, you're not going to perform well in an interview. You're going to not be as efficient in your outreach and your communications and your thinking. So you always sort of start with, the basics of, sleep and eating and working out, right? Like, don't start letting your taking care of your physical self go because you have to double down on LinkedIn outreach or something like that, right? Because then, you show up to an interview and you just kind of look burnt out, to be honest. And, that's in a stressful startup environment. Everybody's looking to say, well, we're all kind of burnt out too. And we kind of want somebody who brings in a positive energy, a healthy energy into our environment. So that's an important consideration. That's why communication is really important too. Communication with significant others, with close friends. Don't keep this process to yourself, right? When you come out of an interview, talk about what you experienced, get perspective from others. And, I think like every interview, every step of this process probably didn't go as bad as you think it did. And your best ones probably didn't go as great as you think it did, right? And if you can start to flatten out that variability, that and try and keep a little stability in your demeanor and your emotions or whatever, that's super helpful. Find people to talk to who ground you is really important. Acknowledge the risk, right? Really look head on at your personal financial limitations, the risk that this process might not work out, the fact that the company may not work out, and really, just acknowledge it, right? That it is possible that this startup that you take a job at may switch course and is more likely to change course than if you were to take a job at a more stable company. But planning for that ahead of time just eliminates the element of surprise. It makes things less stressful. If you go into a situation and you say, look, it's a really interesting company. They obviously don't have everything figured out. I think I can make a lot of great progress in the next 6 months. Not totally clear if this position's still going to be there in 6 months, but I really want the opportunity to work with this team. Then when 6 months comes around and they decide to go in another direction, or they don't have the financing to continue, it's just not going to knock you off your rocker, right? Because you thought about this beforehand. You knew this was a possibility, and it makes that situation a lot less stressful when it does happen. You know that that's within the realm of possibility, as opposed to being overly optimistic. If you can eliminate any uncertainties, that's super helpful. And that comes from both on the company side of this process, the personal side of this process, right? It's like, building a personal budget, right? Knowing that you have to make X amount of dollars. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to pay your rent. You're not going to be able to put away savings and all that sort of stuff. Makes the process easier, right? Because then you don't go into a job situation saying, well, I don't know, maybe I could make that work. And then you go in and it turns out that you can't, or it's too stressful, or what have you. And you really didn't think about it ahead of time. You just try and create as little uncertainty on your side as possible. Say, listen, I definitely need X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, it's not going to work out for me. If you are thinking of moving to a new place, right? Spend some time in that city ahead of time, right? Don't pile on the uncertainties of like, not only am I starting a new job, but I'm also living in New York City for the first time, or working on a remote team for the first time. Do a project for a remote team before you take a position with a remote team, and if you've never done that before. I mean, obviously there was a period of time where we were all remote, but it might be different now that some teams are back in the office, right? So try and eliminate as many uncertainties as possible. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about like what you bring to the table, and this is a really hard thing, and this is why communication is really important. What are your strengths? So I have this expression that interesting people don't know why they're interesting. And I think it is important to kind of look outside yourself and to say, why would somebody hire me? What am I really good at? To first of all, not be afraid to say things like that and to make those kinds of statements. I'm better than average at X. I am one of the best people I know at this. People count on me for X, Y, and Z. That's what I'm offering. And I know I'm particularly good at that. What are your longer term goals? And I don't say those as weaknesses, right? But that's sort of the category I mean there, right? Are there things where you're not as strong at, that you know that if you built up over time, you would be more competitive in the market? right? So you'd say, well, I'm a pretty good product manager, but if I had some more technical skills, I would probably fare better in the job market. So, maybe this next position is an interim position where it may not have the seniority level that you're looking for, but has a certain amount of exposure to things that, beef up your resume and your skill set over the longer term. And be honest, right? Can you actually say that you are a top performer in a certain area? And how do you compare to others? Have you done enough homework to know how you compare to others? It's really, really important, because some folks, they come into the market. Maybe they had a job where they stayed a little too long, they became a little bit complacent, and their peers may have leapfrogged them in terms of skill development, or they're working on platforms that aren't what everybody else is working on, that they're less familiar at. It's better to be honest about that now and to work on, starting to patch up some of those weaknesses than it is to convince yourself that, those guys just didn't really understand what I bring to the table. And, this market's just really tough. No, well, it could also be that you are not in the top quartile of competitiveness for candidates for this position. And well, that might be hard to hear. It's going to be harder to go through 6 or 9 months of a job search process and have it be unsuccessful, right? You'd rather know that now and try and fix that. And that's something where, finding friends and other peers who can be honest about, how you stack up is really important. And there's a context around this. Startups, particularly now, are in a pole position when it comes to hiring talent, right? There have been times over the last couple of years where, you had to settle for the B tier player because the market was so competitive, salaries were so competitive. You just needed to get a certain amount of work done, and so you got somebody solid who's unspectacular and paid them a decent amount of money. And a lot of those folks probably felt pretty good about themselves in terms of their competitiveness in the market. Now the tables have turned a little bit, and startups could afford to wait some folks out, to try and get somebody better, to upskill, to get somebody more senior than the person they might have gotten, maybe just even a year and a half ago. And so, to go back to, am I doing what I can to be the best possible candidate for this position? And so when I say like doggedly pursue interests, what I mean by that is, look, this field is constantly changing. There are constantly new tools going out there, and it's just super important that you spend a lot of time trying to be in the flow of best practices, so that if you're telling me like, yeah, I really want to get a job doing operations for a startup. Well, what evidence is there that you were trying really hard to be the best operations person possible, right? Are you reading the stuff that other people are writing? Are you connecting to people? Who are your mentors in this field? Have you reached out to people who run ops for high-flying startup companies and tried to connect with them? Do you even know who they are? And are you trying to learn from them? Because if you're not, somebody is. And that somebody who is really, really trying is getting up to speed on sort of the latest software stack, the preferred best practices, and they're going to just show better in an interview. They're going to have a better network. So it's really, really important to prove to yourself that, like, yeah, I'm going hard after this, right? Or even in an interest area. When you approach a company and you say, listen, I'd really love to work with you. I'm super bullish about clean tech. I really care about the environment. Okay, but like, does that show? Is that just a mental interest, or are there, minutes and hours and days that you have invested into showing that, right? Do your volunteer activities, do your hobbies, do they reflect that? That's really super important because, again, in a competitive environment, somebody else is going to be able to show that, right? Somebody else is going to be able to say, hey, they got the compost going at their local food co-op, or what have you, and they're just going to be able to show that, like, yeah, I am super passionate about this, and my activities show it. All right, so level setting. This is one of the hardest things to do, and it's just trying to figure out. And the example I always give about this is when I graduated college. As far as I could tell, I was a finance major. I wanted to go into the investment world. As far as I could tell, I needed a good GPA. I was the president of the finance club, and I had a good internship. And that to me seemed to be like as much as I could be doing. I didn't really look outside at what kids at other schools were doing to see where the bar was, right? And so one of the things I wasn't aware of is the fact that there were student managed investment funds where some, rich alumni had donated $1 million to the school to for the students to invest as part of some class. I didn't know that that was a thing. Had I known that that was the thing, I would have pinged every single alumni that I possibly could have from my school and tried to start one of those investment programs. So if you figure that, like, me and my decent GPA and my good internships and my, finance club presidency may have made me, I don't know, like maybe there's one person like me at every school, maybe two people like me at every school. How many thousand, colleges are out there? And so, maybe that made me one of the top 1,000 finance recruits at the time. Well, maybe there were 50 student managed investment clubs, right? And so that means there were 50 presidents of the student managed investment clubs out there. But how many of those student managed investment clubs were started by that president? They probably were around for a little while, right? So there's probably only a handful of people they could say, I got the student managed investment club off the ground. That would have made me like a top 25 recruit coming out of school, right? So, but I just didn't know that that was a thing. It's not that I was unwilling. It's not that I didn't want to put in the effort. I didn't know that that's where the bar was. And so it's super important to sort of, poke up from your cubby and out from behind the Zoom and get out there and just understand, like, what are the best people in my position doing? Are they writing newsletters? Are they, if you tell me that you're really passionate about fintech, somebody pinged me today and say they, run the women in fintech, meetup, and they, are also doing some work at the Barclays Accelerator in the city, right? That person's raising the bar. Super important to know, like where that bar is, because those are the people who are going to get the best opportunities. And I think that, like, most people are willing to do what it takes. They just don't have a good sense of like what the person next to them is doing and what the person who interviews after them is showing on their resume. And that's something you need to get a hold of. Like I said, like, what are the best people offering? Skating to where the puck is going, right? If you are interviewing for a position now, what is the tech community talking about these days? A lot of it is AI driven. Now, that may or may not be relevant to what you're interviewing for. Certainly, if you're interviewing for a venture capital job, it's going to come up, right? The it's you could say, well, the puck's already here. OpenAI is now a $26 billion company, but we're in the first inning of this, right? It is absolutely going to come up in a venture capital job interview for somebody to say, what do you think the right applications of this are? What do you think this is going to open up and change? You have to be thoughtful about that, because that's what these folks are always thinking of, the next thing. And you need to have opinions about that. So I also say, like, be thoughtful about risk. And what do I mean by this? So when I think about the level setting conversation, I like to think about the talent marketplace, the competitiveness around a particular position. I got my first sort of full-time venture capital job working for Union Square Ventures here in New York. Now, I had a student ask me one time, do you recommend going to work at a brand name venture capital fund like you did? And I said, I didn't go to work at a brand name venture capital fund. At the time that I went to go take that job, it was not a known fund. In fact, it was before they announced that they even existed as a fund, right? So when I took that job, I took two elements of risk. I took geographic risk. I decided in 2004 that I was going to take a venture capital job in New York versus the Valley or Boston. And I took firm risk. I decided that this like two-person venture firm who had just barely finished raising their fund was going to be the name I was going to have on my resume for 2 years. Now, it's possible that that firm could have flamed out, right? And a couple of years down the road, people would have said, Union Square Ventures, who? Like, what firm is that? Oh, I never heard of them. Or, oh, that was a spectacular flame out that they invested in a bunch of bad companies or something like that, right? But I knew those two things were the risk. So when I talk to people who want to get into venture capital, I don't think that people are really that thoughtful about the risks they need to take to get a position, because getting the position at Sequoia or Union Square Ventures or Benchmark or Bessemer or whatever is kind of a riskless position these days, right? They're already established funds. And if it's a riskless position, everybody wants it, right? So you're in a ultra competitive environment. If you know that you aren't necessarily the best possible constructed candidate on paper, the former founder who's IPO'd their company and now looking to become a partner at a firm, you need to take some risk trade-offs, right? You need to say, well, clearly I am going to have to work at a firm that hasn't established itself yet. If you're coming in and saying, I'd really like to work at a startup, but something maybe a little bit later stage after they've achieved product market fit, but before they've raised their later rounds and gotten a really high valuation, yeah, that's what everybody wants, right? And a company that's in that position is going to go after the best possible candidate on paper. So you need to be thoughtful about, like, okay, well, if I'm going to break in, where can I take risks that are the soft spots in the wall, right? The place where maybe not as many people are going after, or an industry that's not the hottest thing, right? Or a firm that is just getting up off the ground, or maybe I'm going to take some fundraising risk, right? That I don't know whether they're going to be able to pull off a successful raise, but I'm going to help them do that, or help them hit a goal, enabling them to do that, and then I'll be sort of well positioned. So where can you take that risk and create an opening for yourself in the market? And the last thing here I'll say is the sort of level setting exercise that I recommend for people is what I call the conference project. And the conference project is a way to, in a really structured way, take a survey of the market around me. And how do you do that? So a 2-day conference to me is a proxy for how much you should know about a space. And, the good question about unpaid stuff, and I'll get to that in a second. Is a conference is like a good proxy for how much you should know about a space and how you get up to speed on a space. So let's take, for example, since everyone's talking about like AI, right? Nowadays, if somebody were to put up a conference that says like the future of AI, that's such a general topic. You could drive a truck through it, right? You can drive a robot-driven truck through it, probably. It's way too big. It's way too unfocused. Versus, what does generative AI, how will generative AI impact creative industries? That's much more narrow, right? And when you hone in on that, that could be a really, really interesting 2-day conference. That's kind of a 2-day conference that I think I would find very interesting to go to. A lot of people would, right? So if you hone in on that aperture, that zoom in, that's the kind of thing that you want to tell people you're going after. It's like, hey, I'm really excited about how AI impacts creativity. You want to be, broad enough to be able to fill 2 days worth of conference sessions, but narrow enough that it's like interesting, that a whole bunch of people are going to be like, yeah, that conference is definitely for me. You want to figure out the sessions, right? What are, if this is a single track conference, maybe there's 6 to 8 sessions a day, 3 before lunch, 4 after lunch. What would the topics be? If you don't know what the topics would be, then you don't know enough about your industry segment to really be able to nail an interview. You don't know enough about that industry segment to understand where the opportunities are. And so that should be your bar, right? Can I essentially program a conference? Now, whether or not you actually want to program a conference, like, I would actually encourage it. I think it could be really interesting. I think it could be really interesting for networking purposes. But just as a sort of side exercise, right? What would the sessions be? And what are people are talking about? First of all, there are a lot of conferences out there. There are a lot of webinars and all that sort of stuff. You can go search to see like what are the topics that people are talking about when they put these sessions together, which ones are more interesting or not. But that's sort of the schedule of stuff that's your bar. You need to know about at least that much. And how do you do that? It's following a lot of the content that people put out. It's going to these events. It's following what industry leaders are talking about. It's reading the white papers, like, and so that's the kind of thing that you want to be doing. It's paying attention to the LinkedIn and Twitter and all of that other stuff, but also distilling it and saying like, look, this area is more interesting than that, and I'm not going to focus on everything AI related. You can't just have sessions though, and topics. You need speakers. And this is a proxy for a networking building exercise. And so, it's if you were trying to figure out how to break in, who the 40 to 50 people that would speak at a 2-day conference of X number of sessions with 3 people on a panel, and who would be the moderators and all that, that's your network map, right? The 50 best and most compelling people to talk about AI's impact on the creative space. That's who you need to get to know if you want to get a job in that space. That's who you need to network your way to. That's who you need to be following on Twitter. That's who you need to be following on LinkedIn. That's your network map. And knowing who that is, again, that's the bar. That's the level setting, right? So if you go in to a job interview where you're marketing some new technology that uses AI, and they're going to say, well, how do you think we're competitively positioned? Well, had you done that exercise, you might have been able to say, well, I was thinking of like a newcomers or disruptors panel, because most of these conferences are structured kind of the same. They always have the disruptors panel or the startup panel where somebody's talking about some new cutting edge thing, and who would make a great fit for that. And have you done enough research to be like, no, this startup's actually legit. This one, I don't know, they tweet a lot, but they don't really do anything, right? So have you gone deep on that industry? Should you run it? Yes, I'm a big fan, and I run a ton of events. I am not an event expert. There are lots of venues that have an interest or that are accessible by people who have an interest in bringing this stuff together, right? So, for example, if there was a law firm that wanted to be the top of mind for anybody doing an AI-driven venture capital company, they'd be thrilled to host that, AI and creative conference. And, not saying they have space for 200 people, but, to stick 50 people in a double conference room or whatever, a lot of firms can handle that. And hell, they'd probably, spring for the coffee and the cookies and the lunch for that as well. So, you can sort of get creative about sponsors and spaces and all of that sort of stuff. But as an exercise, I think it's a good sort of network map exercise. Just going into, I just want to handle some of the questions as we go in. Beth Ann asked about doing unpaid consulting. And I think one common thread that you'll find, and we'll talk about like service delivery just in a moment, is that a lot of my approach to getting jobs in the startup space is a consulting related approach. I'm very lucky as a venture capital investor because I get to build out a portfolio of 30 companies, and not all of them are going to work. As a employee trying to get a job in the startup space, if you're taking a full-time job, your portfolio is one. The expected value of one startup is literally zero, right? They're so volatile that it's so hard to pick the right ones. The expected value of one type of share of startup equity or options is zero, right? It's only when you can sort of build a portfolio approach that you actually start to get increased chance of having one of these things be successful. So I am a big fan of trying to figure out, are there 2 or 3 companies at a time that you could start to offer your services to de-risk yourself, right? You could say, hey, I'm going to work, a day or two a week on 3 companies, and let's see which one of these guys pans out. In 6 months that it looks like one of them is actually starting to take off. That's a good way to de-risk yourself. Would I do it unpaid? I wouldn't actually, for 2 reasons. One is, given what I talked about before of, the number of startups out there and how many of them don't actually have money and they aren't real and all this sort of stuff. There's just too much of a chance if you're putting, free work out there that you're just going to run into someone who, the reason why they don't have the money to pay you is because they don't have product market fit. It's not a real business. It's not going anywhere. Might I do it for a company that you find really interesting to show an example of what you can do for something you haven't necessarily done before? Yeah, I might do that. Right. So if, you're saying, I have a knack for a certain kind of marketing, but I haven't done this other type, and I don't have good examples of being able to do this other type, but I, took some General Assembly courses, or I took some online courses about paid acquisition, and there's a company I'm aware of, I really feel like I can help them. Yeah, you might do it to have the client example, the white paper, the example of a deliverable. But I wouldn't do that more than once or twice, just to show that yes, I have done this thing before. It may not be exactly in my previous resume, But it's not a way that I would say that, like, you start doing free work for somebody and you hope that they pay you later. The other reason is that you want to get a job that is important enough for somebody's bottom line for them to make the investment in you. Any other job that is not something where somebody says, yeah, I need to put $1 into that so $2 can come out, is at risk for being cut later. Cut because it's actually too costly, or cut because this is not a focus area for them, right? So you want to be in the areas where, like, startups are actually investing in it important enough. And if you and your resume don't match that, you need to sort of focus on the skate to where the puck is going and say, listen, I am not as competitive as I could be. Actually, it's interesting. My wife recently went through a bit of a career change. She historically was a creative director, and she was attempting to do some creative and branding work for smaller startups. She likes to build, she likes to make things, she likes to use both left brain and right brain to structure a creative product and take it to the finish line. And she was kind of struggling a little bit to find a startup that was willing to pay for all the brand work that she was actually doing with them. And it just wasn't something that they deemed important enough. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board a little bit, and had a baby in that process. You may hear her in the background eating and yelling about her food. That I said, I really think you should look into software development. I really think you'd be able to exercise that left brain, right brain. If you looked into front end software development, I think you'd be able to use a lot of the same sort of skills, the raw skills that you have, but repositioned in a much more competitive thing, because that's something where there's always a need for that thing. There's always going to be an advantage on the talent side to be able to dictate the terms of how they work and how much they work, and salaries are much more competitive, right? So if you sort of say, hey, I'm doing design, but I'm not getting the offers. Maybe you need to dip into the code side of things to make yourself sort of more competitive. Okay, let's keep going on service delivery. I want to try and keep this to an hour if possible. Branding, and we'll get to service delivery in a moment. Branding. So I've often asked people, or I've often said that getting a job is a function of, do you know what you do, and do other people know what you do? And I have people in my network who I have a favorable impression of, that I'm not totally sure what it is they do and if they are good at it. And I think we probably all have friends like this, where, you put out there and your friends would say, let me know if I could be helpful related to helping you get this new job or whatever. But the reality is, do they actually even know what you're good at? Do they know for a fact that you're good at it? How would they know, right? Do they know what kinds of companies to be looking out for, right? They may know your job title from LinkedIn. They may know some vague notion of what it is that you do, but they might not have enough data to understand that, like, if I run into a certain type of company, or a company in the healthcare space that has to deal with a lot of compliance issues, or a company in the transportation space, the clean transportation space that has to do with a lot of government contracts, or what have you, they might not know that level of granularity, so you might not be top of mind. So and then, deliverables too. It's like, does your network know, and do people that you're approaching from a job perspective know what you ultimately deliver? If you say that you do sales consulting, well, like, what am I going to get at the end of this, right? And I think I had some examples here. Yeah, exactly. It's very different to say you are a sales consultant versus saying, I help B2B SaaS companies that are just starting to build out their sales teams, set pricing, set comp, figure out sales operations, maybe something on the tooling side, and hire for those people. In fact, I wrote the founding head of sales playbook, right? In terms of thinking of like content ideas and all this sort of stuff. I get companies from the founder doing selling to the flywheel turning in the organization. If you were that specific about your offering, it would be, you'd get much higher quality signal to noise from your network and say, wait, I totally know a company at exactly that point. You would absolutely be the first person thought of. And in fact, like, that specific deliverable feels valuable, right? That like, you don't just do sales consulting where somebody comes in and kind of kicks the tires of what I'm doing and charges me money and kind of tells me things I may already know or not. And I don't really know if that's going to be valuable versus like, if I'm the lone founder selling, yeah, at some point, I'm going to have to figure out my comp structure. I'm going to have to figure out my pricing. I'm going to have to figure out what tools I even use and how I do my outreach and stuff like that. And I'm out selling, right? Anytime I take away from doing that, I'm not selling. So I definitely need somebody to bring that. No one's going to turn that away if you can present a deliverable that is that compelling and that high need. Here's another example, right? I help new product companies figure out the basics of their design and branding before they spend money on a big agency, right? So I've got a product out there, maybe it's a CPG. I'm a little worried about, going to one of these big agencies and spending an arm and a leg. Not quite there yet, but I need to do a little fundraising and, where I need to make a presentation to a retailer or to the partner, and I need to like at least get the sense that I have something. I can't spend $250,000 on this thing, but how do I just like get going? How do I, target my market a little bit and figure out, what my messaging should be on this product? You wrote something that was the don't hire an agency until you read this, right? Every single person who was, vexed over, the cost of an agency would somehow find their way to that post, right? And if you said, listen, before you go to an agency, I have a thing that I do with people. I have an offering. I sit with a company for X number of weeks. I charge this. Here are my deliverables. That's a really good on-ramp because that there are companies stuck in that specific pain point. You do something to address that specific pain point. You do it in sort of a finite way with a deliverable where you'd say, yeah, I would spend $5,000 on that exercise or 10 grand on that exercise if I knew I could get X, Y, and Z. And the alternative is spending $200,000 with an agency. That's going to be a really competitive offering. And that's where I get into service design, which I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. I think I botched the order of these pages. Yeah, so I did. Service design. Do people know when to recommend you? And do you have a menu of options and deliverables? So for example, I just spoke to someone who I know well, who I like. I think they're smart. They do some consulting and they met with a portfolio company of mine. They had a conversation. This person came back and they said, here's my impressions of the company. And I was kind of left with like, am I recommending you for something specific? Like, you didn't give me this is what I could do for them. this is, you give me 100 days, I could get them from A to B. Here's how I would do it. Here's how much time I would spend with them. This would be the cost. And then I might say, look, that's a little more money than we were willing to spend, but this part of the project is really, really useful. How much would it be for that? At least it's a starting place. And I could pick sort of one from column A, one from column B, and at least you can sort of get going. That also drives confidence. The more transparent you are about, like, this is what I could think I can do, this is how long it would take, here's what I would be doing. This is why I think, like, sharing some of these posts where people put up about, here's how I grew this company from this to this, here are the 10 steps for generating great email campaigns, or hiring for sales, or opening up a retail location and getting traffic in the door, or whatever it is that you do. You may be worried about, like, I don't want to give away what I do because then they're not going to be able to pay me for it. No, they don't have time, right? You should tell them exactly what you're going to do and exactly what makes that successful, because they're already doing 3 jobs. Right? They are hiring you not because you figured out the secret sauce, but because you're the best at doing something that they don't have the time to do. And the last thing I would say is, like, this is the kind of thing that can be incredibly valuable in a forwardable email, right? Hey, Charlie, do you have any companies that are stuck in this spot? I have a service offering where I help them get from A to B. This is how much I charge. I'm more than happy to send that to people, especially when you think about how people evaluate an email. They got a couple of seconds, they're super busy, and they're like, wait, you're telling me I can get X, Y, and Z, and it's going to cost me this, and it takes this long? Yes, I want to talk to that person. Versus, like, something that's a little more hand wavy. I do consulting on this, and I don't know if I want to talk to them. I don't have a good sense of this is going to be a fit. Now I got to get on the phone and figure out if it's a fit. They aren't speaking my language, that they understand what my pain points are. Okay, so this is the brand slide that I didn't have before. So here's another project that I have thrown out there. If you are looking to market yourself, let's say either you are planning a job change this year, or you are forced into a job change, you really need to think about branding and marketing. And there's some folks who would say, listen, I need a job as soon as possible. I really don't have time to sort of build up my brand, and this is a long, slow burn. Well, there's that expression, like, best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, second best time is now. Is that, like, this is not the last job search you're going to have. Wouldn't the next job search be easier if you announced to a following that, even a small following, doesn't have to be 100,000 newsletter readers, that you are looking for a specific thing, and that inbound opportunities started coming to you, right? So maybe that's not going to be what happens in this particular job search, but let's set that up so the next one happens. The project idea that I give to people who are thinking about producing content or writing up best practices is a book outline. And the reason why I think about a book outline is because I think it's way easier to come up with one idea that you can stretch out over a year or two than coming up with an idea every single day. If you have to sort of think about, like, yeah, I think I want to start a TikTok that sort of positions me as a thought leader and whatever, and every single day you need to come up with an idea for a new TikTok, that is an enormous amount of brain bandwidth that the average person just does not have. However, if you sort of think about it in terms of what nonfiction book could you write, and it doesn't have to be a book, but like 18 to 24 months from now, that if you published and it became a bestseller, it would be gangbusters for your career. And let's go back to that, what creators need to do in the face of the coming AI revolution or something like that, or how creative companies can defend themselves against AI and even take advantage of that or something like that, right? If you thought about like that's the one idea, right? I'm going to split that idea into 10 chapters. Nonfiction books about 65,000 words, so every chapter is about 6,500 words. You can actually break that 6,500 words of chapter segments into different forms of media, right? So your average podcast has a certain amount of spoken words per minute. Half of that's actually high quality content. Half of that is intros and outros and commercials. You start to build a formula that says, you know what, but chapters probably 3 podcast episodes, or the average Twitter thread with 8 tweets and 40 words a tweet is 320 words, and so 20 Twitter threads or a month's worth of Twitter threads is actually a chapter. Like, you sort of mess around with the different formats and say, I'm going to put out this much content. I'm going to, break it up into video or podcast or, interviews or, PowerPoints or whatever comes naturally to you. And they're all going to be sort of building blocks for this bigger thing, right? So, you'd say, okay, this creator book, what I really need to do is just like interview 60 creators or 60 people in this creative AI space, and I've got a book, right? Because if half of those interviews are good content, that literally is going to be a book's worth of content. So that's going to get me there, right? It's much easier to put together to say, who'd be the right 60 people to talk about this kind of thing, than to, on an open-ended basis, start today and say, I'm going to start tweeting or TikToking or whatever about this topic, and I'm like not sure where it's going to go, and at some point I'm going to run out of ideas and all this sort of stuff. And the other thing about this, maintaining this consistency, is that, look, most of your posts on any of these social networks and stuff like may not get seen by everybody they need to get seen by, right? So you put out that, hey, I'm looking for a job, I'm looking for an opportunity, you post it once, most of your network by percentage is not going to see it, right? But if you are on a regular basis talking about this, AI and creatives or whatever, right? Your friend who works for, Sony Music or works for, some, Cartoon Network, right? I don't know, whatever, some creative field where they have IP. Is going to ping you and to say, hey, this like generative AI stuff started coming up in the office, and I got tasked with kind of learning about it, and I've seen you start posting about it on a regular basis. Like, can we talk about this? Like, maybe there's something to be done here, maybe there's some consulting opportunity here. So just being consistent about a narrative, I think, is really helpful for increasing your chances, right? Because it might not get you the job next week or the week after, but the more shots on goal you have to get noticed for a particular topic, the better. Some people don't want to talk about themselves, and that's fine. Some people feel like putting content out there is boastful. They look at the current environment and what Twitter looks like, and they're just like, oh, that's a cesspool, I don't want to contribute to that, I don't want to be that person. Well, listen, you're not that person. Your tweets, your posts wouldn't be like that, right? But I understand the sort of hesitancy. You could make your public persona about interviewing other people, right? To say, look, I care a lot about making urban environments more family friendly, and I want to find technologies and projects that do that kind of thing I don't necessarily know all the answers, but I'm passionate about it. I'm going to find the people who know the answers and pick their brain about it and create a platform for them. So my brand is going to be their passion because it's my passion too. And people are going to start to get to know me as a connector of people who are, talking about, families and urban environments or whatever, but I'm not the expert and I don't feel like I'm the expert yet. So I'm going to do a lot of interviews. And that takes the pressure off, frankly. Look, if you're, the content you're putting out there is interviewing the top experts left and right, your next job interview is going to have a lot more confidence that like, oh, you're in the flow of best practices because look at all these like really smart people that you're talking to. All right, nearing the end here of my marathon. I am at the end. Awesome. I got 2 questions up on the Q&A. I am happy to answer any other questions. I also recognize it is a couple minutes after 6. But if anybody wants to jump in with a question or raise their hand, we got a hand raised here. Let's see. How do I do this? Allow to talk. Sandra.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. It was super insightful. And I'm currently a second year sophomore undergrad student at college.
Oh, that's awesome. What school?
I mean, NYU.
Cool.
Yeah, and so like I feel like over the course of like finding out like job at a startup, what I feel like as a college student that there's certain like obstacles that we kind of like we have to really demonstrate our previous experiences. But like now I feel like is for startups they're more they care more about like how can you execute, like can you kind of really do this stuff, or can do you have the skills that are marketable, as opposed to kind of like sending out a resume just like some kind of deadlines around narrative. So like I'm curious about how can college students, especially freshmen, sophomore, at this current stage, like really demonstrate our skills through like what kind of projects, or like how to really like kind of like tell the story in a way that will be kind of marketable, hireable to student founders. Yeah, for
Sure.
found.
So the angle that I would play, and frankly, we should talk because I'm hiring an intern, and is actually related to use of tools and use of tech tools. So you have to keep in mind, like realistically, a startup is not going to hire somebody straight out of college or an intern over the summer or whatever to come up with their marketing strategy or to run their paid acquisition or to do selling or whatever. The jobs you're going to get as a college student, as an intern, are going to be a little bit jack of all trades. Like there's going to be kind of some intern work, and look, the same was true when I was an intern, is that my early proficiency with Excel, I mean, now I'm like dating myself, but like I wound up with a high school internship in 1997. We had a computer in our house for 10 years. 1987, my dad came home with a computer. And I was interviewing with one of my fellow high school students, and they asked us like, oh, do you know how to use Excel? In 1997, like not every high school kid like knew how to use Excel or had ever used it. So like I had in fact used it, and it was my Excel proficiency that got me in the door, right? Because there was somebody there who had the most boring, most painstaking 10%, 5% of their work that they wanted to offload. And they needed somebody who just knew how to use Excel. And that they could make the 2-week investment or 1-week investment in teaching somebody. And it is that kind of proficiency. Today, it's like, do you know how to make a TikTok? Do you know how to use Canva? Do you know how to use Descript and clip a podcast together? Right. I would say like probably for most college students, like content creation is probably like the easiest. Data research, right? Have you Have you ever used Crunchbase? And do you know how to help build out a target list of every company that has raised at least $30 million and is in my space that I could go and sell to, right? Do you know some LinkedIn recruiting tools and all that sort of stuff? Like, that's how to get in the door as a student. Really, it's a lot of tools based, and frankly, I think the answer to a lot of these questions is like, yes, I know how to use that. And then you go home and you figure out how to use that thing. And you take an online class and just kind of figure it out. And that's kind of the approach of getting in the door. And then once you get in, you start to actually learn about that space. You start to learn about how the marketing works or whatever. But being knowledgeable enough to be dangerous on the tools to take some of that administrative side is how I would sort of break in. Any other questions? Oh, we have another question on the, what are your thoughts on leveraging VCs to find roles at their portfolio companies? Look, if somebody actually did some of the stuff that I talked about and had a very compelling service delivery and said, listen, do you have companies that have X, Y, and Z issue or need this particular thing? And it was very sort of discreetly crafted and had a deliverable. I'd be more than happy to send that to my entire portfolio. I don't need to sit down and do the 30-minute coffee where we talk about it and you pitch yourself to the VC, because the chances that any one of my portfolio companies needs your exact skill set might be low at any given time. And frankly, it's probably not worth the, I'm speaking as if my time is super precious, but I do feel that way. I have a 1-year-old, so it's probably not worth the 30 minutes of coffee, when in reality it's probably more efficient for you to tell me what you do, for me to forward it on to my portfolio companies. And then if somebody raises their hand and says, yeah, listen, Adam's super compelling. He offered to start helping out on X, Y, and Z, but actually I think he could do X other stuff. I might circle back around and interview you and say, yeah, I do think he's a fit for this. And I do think it's worth taking the chance on him for that thing, but sort of not up front. But we certainly have big lists of companies. But a lot of people ask me for coffee and all of that sort of stuff. That's not the approach. It's the direct email or the, I saw a position, I feel like I could be pretty good for that thing. And, VCs put themselves out there more than a lot of founders do. So, if you glom along on Twitter or LinkedIn and you're like, hey, I remember when you invested in that company, I've been following it for a little while, even if you kind of make it up a little bit. And you directly email in and you get forwarded by me, maybe that just gets you a little more of a look than it would if you, cold approach the company. But also I don't necessarily think that founders pay that much more attention to something that comes in through their VC unless the VC actually knows the person and can speak directly to their effort. So, founders kind of always in their inbox, and, a well-crafted, direct, personal, hey, I listened to your interview here, and I had a thoughtful question or had a comment or whatever, that goes pretty far if you're willing to make that personal time and investment to really actually follow a founder. You can't, you email 35 founders cold and because they've all raised Series Bs, and you send the congrats on all your success, no one's going to notice that. You email the 2 founders that you actually heard in a podcast interview somewhere and you listen to it all the way through, you have a percentage chance of getting a response that is worth the investment and time. That's what I'll say about that. Hope this has been super helpful. If you have any other further questions, feel free to drop me an email or ping me on Twitter. I will put up the video for this somewhat shortly. And I wish everybody the best of luck. Thanks for hanging around. Have a good night.